continue our exploration, deep dive into Orach Chaim 150. We are now in the laws of the basic Knesses and the laws of the shul, the obligation to build the shul. So we talked about going to shul, we talked about having to be in shul, we talked about having to stay in shul. But now we're going to actually talking about building a shul. Right? We talked about all these things. We talked about it parenthetically, but we didn't start with that. We actually started with the person getting up in the morning at home and all the obligations of the minyan and what that minyan is supposed to look like. But we didn't talk about the building itself so much. We talked about being in shul, but we didn't really talk about the particulars of shul. We're going to deal with that a little bit. What's actually interesting, I was thinking about this as we began this year. There is an obligation to build a shul, which you'll see here in a minute in the Mishna Berura as he brings the Lashon of the Rambam. But I was thinking, there's no obligation to build other certain things in the community that are mentioned in the same way, like, for example, the mikvah. So Rav Moshe Feinstein actually asked this question, interestingly enough, and he says that a community also has an obligation to build infrastructure that are meant to meet the requirements of the community, including a mikvah. It's just that you don't have to build a mikvah if you already have like a cave somewhere filled with water. So there's no really an obligation because naturally occurring water, which is what most mikvahs are, they don't have to worry about building one. It's just that nowadays most of the naturally flowing water sources are purified and meant to not be carrying all kinds of fun, weird diseases in them. So we don't look to encounter naturally occurring bodies of water so much anymore. So there's not really an obligation in that sense to go look for it. Most people would have it. But the idea to have an obligation to prepare a place that is meant for the gathering to pray is a very important obligation that we will talk about today. So building the shul, and that should be the tallest. Okay? And it has 5 halachos. So 150 says, so we force the members of the city, or they force each other to build a shul, and they also have to buy Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, a full Tanakh. Okay, and we talked about this earlier, if they have to actually pay for a minyan as well. But let's talk about the building of the shul. So the Mishnah starts off by quoting the Rambam in chapter 11 of the Laws of Tefillah. Okay, so every place where there are 10 adult male Jews, one must prepare for them a house where which they can gather. The words are Bayit Shayich Nesubal, the Tefillah. Okay, and they can go there to gather for prayer at every time of prayer. And this place is called Beis HaKnesses. Okay. And even a few people can force the not large number of people, but that is actually discussed in Choshen Mishpat. It's in chapter 163:1. That is not here in Orach Chaim. Here we're talking about simply what that shul looks like. Okay, so we say the obligation is to build one. So what does it mean to build one? So the Mishnah Berurah explains that if they don't have the ability to build one, they can rent a space to daven. And the poskim write that in the process of building a shul, they can collect based on people's income levels. Okay, so a progressive system, as we like to call it here in the U.S. And especially when you're collecting money, that's for building. But when you're talking about renting it, you can collect. You can do it based on participants and partly on income. Okay, so meaning if we're renting, then everyone needs to contribute because no one's really an owner, so everyone needs to use it. The Magen Avraham writes at the end of 154, so it's not in our Siman, but it's pertinent to us. And he quotes the Rivash, and this is the Rivash at the end of, and this is the Rivash, is also quoted by the Ramah in Choshen Mishpat at the end of chapter 162, that someone who prevents the building of the shul, even if there's another shul in the community, okay, they are preventing the majority of people from performing an easy mitzvah. And therefore he concludes that if the shul is basically stopping them, or it's ruining the other minyan, then one group can stop the other group from breaking off. There's also a tshuva from the Radvaz. The Radvaz writes, this is in his volume 3, and it is responsa number 472, And he really goes into the large number of issues in this area. And at the end of it, he writes the following: that when everyone is kind of like in the same mindset, and they are sort of saying, "Hey, we really could use another shul," okay? But if they're trying to break away from each other, okay, and if they're trying to break away, it's not so good. But they find that the davening will be better if this one stays by themselves, and that one stays by themselves, okay. And a person shouldn't make an error to say that I think that it's a good idea to break off. No, that's not what I'm saying, because it says that we should gather together. This is a quote he brings from the beginning of Yirmiyahu. It says, "Chovra atzavim Ephraim hanachlo chelek libam ata yeshamo." Right here we were trying to bring all of Ephraim together, and now you're trying to break away. So really, you should make an effort that everyone should try to be together and have only the highest of intentions. And if it's impossible to that, well, and if they're always fighting, so then it's better to push them away from each other and keep them away from each other. Okay, that's what he says. So it's interesting to look at that. In the Pischei Tshuva in Choshen Mishpat 162, he also goes in depth into these issues. So maybe if anyone's interested, drop me a line and I can prepare a separate class just on those issues about when the obligation arises to build a shul. So he also said there's an obligation to get scrolls not only of the Torah, and not only the Torah scrolls, also the scrolls of the Navi for Haftarah, but also scrolls from the Ksuvim, so like the Megillos, okay? But the reason over here is there's an obligation. The obligation to have them is so that way anybody from the synagogue could come and read them, okay? And that's also a public obligation, almost like there's a public obligation to create a library of all of our written documents. And that's also in Kusamach Gimel in 163. But that was back in the day because we didn't write a lot of stuff down, okay, other than that. But nowadays, you have to buy all types of books. You have to buy a Talmud, you have to buy commentaries in the Talmud, things that children could access, things that adults could access, okay? And a place where lots of books are accessible, meaning you can go buy them on your own. Then the only thing that you have to buy is a Sefer Torah, because they could borrow from other people. But what he means is Sefer Torah and also Nevi'im, so for Haftarah. So that's the obligation. Okay, even though he doesn't say the Nevi'im, you should actually have to buy that. We've talked about it before about whether or not you have it, or people can afford it or not. So it sounds from here that you would actually have to buy that. All right. The second halacha: one may only build the synagogue at the highest point of the city, and you must raise up the point of the synagogue until it is at least higher than all the other city buildings. Okay, which is to the exception of what's known as baranios. What are baranios? Baranios are structures that are made at edges of the city to just make it look nicer. Okay. And so they're not really meant to be dwelled in, okay? They're just meant to be nice, decorative spires, and also protective towers that you don't really use them other than for that, and also the top of buildings when those buildings are slanted, okay, and you can't actually use the top of them. You have to use at the highest point of use. That's the main point of the thing. So if there's an attic, okay, underneath the pitched roof, then that shouldn't be higher than the shul itself. The Ramah adds, now in times of great needs, or if there's some type of concern from the government that they don't want you to build such an obvious synagogue, okay, or the synagogue correctly, then one may go ahead and put their prayers into a house, even though people live upstairs, okay? As long as you treat the upper areas with cleanliness, which will be explained at the end of Siman Kuf Nun Aleph, which is 151, okay? This is also why people sometimes object to having a synagogue in their building, because then that we have a Sefer Torah, then that means that it's annoying for them up above. Okay? But let's look at the Mishnah Berura. At the highest point in the city. Why? Because it says, Barosh homios tikra. You shall call out at the highest points of the land. Okay, so that's where we see the obligation for that. So it has to be taller than all other dwelling homes, because it says, the Romeim es beis Elokeinu, in order that we lift up the house of God. Now, there's places where they're not worried about this. And the later rabbis write, is because there's so many places where the non-Jews live, and they are so high, and to try to build higher than those houses, it's going to be hard. But you're also not going to see that it is a shul. So the main thing is that it's best to be careful with how you build the shul, because the Gemara is really, really particular about making sure that you put the shul as sort of the main emphasis of where people pray, and that people should take notice of the house of prayer. So you might ask, well, they build all these skyscrapers for people to live in. So that may just one shouldn't have to say that you have to build a shul to be higher than the rest of it, but should be at a point or at a place where people would recognize. So what they sometimes do is they take these high-rise buildings and put the shul in the middle, so the shul gets a special place. So that, in effect, as long as it's a recognizable place, it may not have to be the highest place. But back in the ancient world, having it at the highest point was the way in which it became the most distinguished. But nowadays, where tall buildings are just really to keep people more accessible to city centers. So then, if having a special place where real estate is a commodity, having a special place for the shul would be more impressive than having it be really tall. If it was really tall, because you wouldn't even see it as being different. Having it being a smaller and designed differently building would make it stick out. Okay, so towers that are made just for beautification. So that's to say that they really are just pieces of art, and you don't use them at all. And so therefore, even the houses themselves that are really tall, they're not that big a deal. Okay, and then we also finished off with, you have to be careful with what you use on top of the shul, which is to say that the basic Knesset is still lower than your own home, but still okay as long as you are careful with everything above it. 3, one who builds their home taller than the shul. Some people say that you force him to make it lower, right? It's an interesting housing code over here. Make your house lower than the shul. And the Ramah adds, and if you build a structure and it is higher than even one corner of the shul, then you can go ahead and just make that one corner less. Okay? All right. Now, let's Mishna Berura. So he says that, what does it mean that be taller just on one corner? Okay, meaning that's like, I guess it means, I'm not sure it means exactly one corner, it means off to the side. So the Mishna Berura wants to explain what this means. So it means to say that the corner means that the corner of one of the corners of the synagogue is taller. Okay, so this is when the top of the roof itself, or the upper level itself, is the taller part. But not where you take like some metal pole, right, which you put at the top like a wind vane. That wouldn't help. You have to have the actual corner of the roof higher than the other buildings, even though the other buildings come up to those specific points. Okay, so as long as you can recognize and like see the shul, that's the main thing. Okay, halacha 4: if someone builds their house facing the windows of the shul. Okay, so remember, we're going to learn later on the shul's going to have 12 windows. If you build your house facing a window, you can't just put your house only 4 amos, or about 6 to 8 feet away, because the shul needs lots of space and lots of light. Okay, so therefore you have to leave more space. This is a choshen mishpat type deal, but we're learning about it in Orach Chaim. So what is the Mishna Berura explains? It needs more light than having you obstructing some of the light. So if you build your house on your property against the window of your friend, normally you only have to leave him airspace between his wall and your wall of arba amos, which is between 6 to 8 feet. So that way you aren't darkening his windows. But for a shul, it needs a lot more light. Okay? And so therefore, those windows, if they came first, they can demand more space, and because they demand more light. Now the only thing is we don't know what that amount is. So at least it should be 8 amos, and that's just twice as long. So that should be enough. And this is he says the Mishnah says this is a tshuva from the Rabbi Yehuda that's brought down in the Sharei Tshuva. The Sharei Tshuva is a work on Orach Chaim that quotes a lot of tshuvas. And it's quoting the tshuva of the Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Pri Megadim doesn't know what space you need to leave for other parts of the shul. So what about the front porch or the courtyard of the shul? How much space to leave for that? I don't know. What about the windows in the women's courtyard, like upstairs? Do they need arba amos, or I don't know? So the Mishnah Berura says, I think that it's not clear, and we therefore shouldn't have to force other people to do something that's not a clear law. There's a Ramah who has a similar question in one of his responsa, and it's number 32. And he says that the front courtyard of the shul, so you have the shul and then the front courtyard. And it's not like private use, okay? It's like public use. So if people are building houses adjacent to it, and they're opening up themselves some space that opens up into it, and some windows, okay, so normally you consider this opening up your windows to like public area, and that would be fine. But if the shul opens up the windows of the synagogue, okay, the people who have the synagogue, if they open it up, they decide they're going to face the windows into this courtyard, so then people could say, well, then you need to keep some space here so we get more light into the building. And that's talking about where one person is opening up his home's windows into this public space, okay? And they can't build in here directly because they would have the problem of the community themselves wanting to also open up and use this space. However, whoever came first could make the claim of, I was here first, and this was a public space. And so therefore they could prevent the other party from building. So the Ramah is different over here than what he says in another place in Choshen Mishpat, that when the community is trying to do something, you can't say, I was here first. However, in this case, where we don't want to have to introduce litigation unnecessarily, you could actually make a claim that you should be able to open up your windows privately into this space. There's another quote over here where he says that if someone has a window that is opened into the public area, and people walk in front of that window towards the synagogue, okay, you cannot pour your urine, because this is going back centuries, right, into that public domain, because people are going to shul, and they're gonna, if it's really early, they might step in it, all right? And they don't get them wet and yucky with your muddy bathroom water, right? Fortunately, we have indoor plumbing; it's not a problem. And so, therefore, you shouldn't pour it there, okay? And also, you really shouldn't pour it in a place where other people are walking at all anyway, because that might be a danger to them, and you actually might be obligated by the rules of Nezek not to pour the urine from your chamber pots out there. Talk about keeping the old ways alive. The old ways alive. The Mishnah was written in the early 20th century, so even back then, back in Radin and Lithuania and Poland, people didn't have indoor plumbing, and they were still doing that stuff. Another case that he points out: the neighbors of a shul, and they have a bathroom nearby. The bathroom, if the smell reaches the shul, then they have to move the bathroom, and that's even if the bathroom came first, the shul came later. Got to move the bathroom, okay? Because this is something that damages lots of people, and the community can go ahead and make the claim you have a stinky bathroom nearby that you have to take care of. However, they have to contribute to the monetary cost of moving it. So they may not want to move it, but that the owner of the private home has to move it because he's damaging lots of people, the public space, but the public has to contribute to them helping them move it. Okay, so it's almost like a case of eminent domain. And you can see this case discussed in detail in Choshen Mishpat 155:22. And the Magen Avraham at the end of Kuf Dalet also, that we quoted earlier. Let's see, how are we doing over here? I think this is our last one. So yeah, so let's do the last one over here, and then we'll be done for today. We'll finish with Kuf. So this halacha is the entrance to the shul should be opposite the direction in which people pray in that city. Okay? You can only open up the shul in a direction for the proper direction to pray. So if people there pray westward, then put the what's it called? The window or the openings on the east side. So that way that when they go ahead and bow and they're bowing towards where the Torah is, that should be the direction in which they are praying. So, meaning that you want to have the entrance behind you. Okay, we actually talked about this at the end of last time when we talked about moving the Sefer Torah. You want to have it going towards the entrance of the building. Okay, the Ramah says, and you put the bima in the middle of the shul, so that the person reading the Torah should read from it, and the entire building should hear from that spot. And when the Shliach Tzibor is praying, he's facing the Aron Kodesh. And also, when you sit, you should sit where the oldest people in the synagogue are sitting with themselves facing the rest of the community. And the community should be sitting in rows, okay, facing towards the Aron Kodesh and towards the Zakanim. What does that mean? So in that city, we picked the direction. So it's because, therefore, like in a place like when the Mishnah Berura lived, okay, where in those countries where they pray and where they bow they're bowing eastward, okay, because they're on the west of Israel, okay, it's just to go to Mizrach. Everything is supposed to point towards Israel, and so therefore you put the entrance of the shul on the west side, okay, which is not what the Shulchan Aruch was talking about where he lived in. Many people had been living in Bavel. They had to do it the opposite way. And that's where he gets that's where he had the law from. But in the case that we're talking about, you always want to have the opening opposite the direction which people are praying and davening towards Israel. Okay, the Magen Avraham says that if the entranceway is on the other side, and the shul gets destroyed, and some people want to go ahead and make a new opening, so people can't go ahead and stop them from making a new opening, okay? Even if they're the majority, and even if it changes the direction in which they are sitting. Okay, so it's an interesting rule. So some people want to rebuild it, and some people want to open the other side. So you always want to keep the door facing the proper side. Let's see, what else? Okay, so people need to face the Aron, and the reason why is because you put the Aron, as the Rambam himself said, that you need to put the Aron on the side to which everyone is davening towards, and especially in that city, meaning that everyone should be facing towards the center of the holiness itself, which is the Sefer Torah and the Aron Kodesh. Okay, you put the bima in the middle, okay, and you don't put more than 6 steps going up to the bima, the Mishna Berura explains. And when the Shatz leads, the Ramah is explaining, which should have said longer, he's quoting the Tur. What he's trying to say is that when the Shliach Tzibor is standing to lead prayer services, he has to come down from the bima, okay, and come in front of it, and he should be facing the Aron Kodesh. Okay, that's what he meant to say. And the seating arrangement is what the Ramah brings. So we have a different one. So now the way we organize the seating arrangement is that people who buy seats, they need to be careful that their seats are the ones that are closest to the bima, and between the bima and the aron itself. But they need to be sitting facing towards the bima, and the back of them towards the aron. And some people do that, but that's not appropriate, and it's also prohibited. So you really should have your seats facing towards the aron kodesh. Okay, and so that's the rule for how to keep the seating that way. And so therefore, a person should always have his face towards the aron kodesh and the back towards the bima, and not in places where they turn the seats around towards the bima only. Okay, and because really the truth is that the bima becomes like a separate place for the Torah to go be, and so therefore it should always face towards the aron kodesh. And with that, we end our discussion of how to build a shul. We learned about you should build it facing in a direction facing Eretz Yisrael, that the shul gets precedence when we're talking about getting the window space, gets a little bit more excessive space. You shouldn't have your plumbing and other such things or any other smelly things going towards the shul, and all your seats should be facing towards the front, and all the old guys sit in the front facing the opposite direction. And as we said earlier, another one, I'm surprised doesn't mention it, but as we said earlier, they sit on something called Mizrachmont. They sit on the east wall, but they're sitting next to the aron, and therefore they're allowed to have their backs to the wall and their faces towards the people. But people sitting between the beam and the aron, even though if they feel like they shouldn't do that, they shouldn't do that. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time we continue our discussion of the laws of the Beis Knesset. Take care.